So what do these three Game Boys have in common? Answer: they're all kind of terrible to actually use. I don't know how people dealt with this back in the day, including myself, and I don't know how Nintendo got away with not releasing a Game Boy with a backlit or frontlit screen until what, 2002? Has anyone used an old Game Boy recently? A stock old Game Boy, especially this first model. It's basically unplayable. Game Boy Color's a little bit better. Game Boy Advance is a little bit worse. It's actually insane how difficult it is to actively play a game and be immersed in it when the entire time you're struggling to just see the screen. Seriously, this is as good as it gets. I have a desk lamp here right behind me shining directly on the screen. And even then it's still not easy to see. And once you start moving around, the refresh rate is terrible. Everything becomes a blurry, muddy mess. I legitimately cannot use this thing for actually playing games, although it does look cool. But fortunately, we don't have to use this anymore, because that's where this thing comes in. Modded Game Boys, they're pretty awesome, and they're not that hard to make. There's quite a scene around putting together these things and developing backlight and screen replacement kits for them, and there's been a whole lot of advancement in that field in just the last few years. This system here has a history to it. I tried modding it a few years back with an older method where you basically put a backlit panel behind the original screen, which kind of worked well, but it didn't fix the motion blur. But I ended up kind of screwing that up after opening it up later on again to try and clean some dust out. So this thing sat unused for a couple years until I bought this kit about a year ago. This is a Q5 mod. It basically uses, and you can see it sticking out of the bottom here, leftover new old stock from a BlackBerry Q5 smartphone paired with some sort of controller board behind the screen that communicates with the original Game Boy. And it's fantastic. I don't even know what more to say about it other than this is just basically the best experience you could get with an original Game Boy. The screen has a quick refresh rate. It looks nice and modern, but it still feels authentic, especially because of the pixel filters you can put on this thing, which I have set up that make it look like it's got the original grid. Oh yeah, and you can change the color palette. I have this custom one set here because I like the way it looks. The contrast knob has been replaced with this wheel here that adjusts the brightness, and you can hold it down to adjust other settings like the positioning of the screen if you don't get it perfectly lined up, and then you can turn on this pixel effect. Let's see if we can see it here. Yeah, look at the counter. You can see it turn off and back on. I actually really like it on because it feels much more authentic to the original Game Boy design, and it works really well with this specific kit and this specific screen. Not all of them look great. There's other screens you can get, but this one really does. This was a Game Boy I bought off of eBay around 8 years ago now, and I tried to mod it with what was called a backlit and bivert mod, and I failed. So I shipped it off to someone who is more of a professional, and they did it and succeeded. But there was some dust under the screen that just drove me nuts. So like several months later, I opened it up to try and clean the dust out, and I screwed up the ribbon cable that connects the screen to the motherboard, and it broke. Um, I was still learning. I was not as good at working on electronics as I am now. I have made a lot of progress since then, but this thing sat unused in a crate for like 6 years. And then I bought this kit, and it wasn't that difficult to install. I don't know if it's just because the process is better, more well documented, or I'm just better at working on stuff, but I was very successful. And the reason it's designed like this is because the original Game Boy was a play it loud clear model, and the screw holes for some of the screws going to the front panel were stripped in the past. So I bought a replacement shell that's this darker clear see-through plastic, and then you get this two-tone look because I just used the front of that replacement shell and the original back. So you get this cool light and dark clear two-tone look that I actually really like. But I installed this kit and it works perfectly, and now there is actually a functional, usable original Game Boy. All real hardware still. It's not like this is an emulator or anything like that. It's just this thing to its fullest potential. But it's not the only one I've done. Out of these three non-modded Game Boys I showed earlier, the Game Boy Color is actually the easiest one to see. I definitely will not say that it is easy to see, but there's much less blur in movement and motion. The refresh rate is way better. and the colors aren't too dark, so if you have a light background, it's not too hard to see. Just personal side note, a yellow Game Boy Color was my very first game system ever that I bought used when I was like, well, I didn't really have money. My parents bought it for me used when I was like 6 years old, just before the Game Boy Advance came out. But I no longer have that system. This is not the same one. I sold it long time ago, and then I bought another one eventually. But yeah, yellow Game Boy Colors hold a lot of nostalgia for me. But then I found this blue one in a thrift store, and it worked, but it was pretty beat up. I still feel a little bad about throwing out the original screen that was in this. I could have found some way to repurpose that or sell it to someone who needed it, but whatever. I put a kit in this one. Actually, I put two kits in this one. The original kit I used actually had a smaller screen, a smaller display. That was like wasn't quite as large as the original Game Boy Color screen, which is actually already kind of small. So I installed that and it worked, but I didn't really like it. But then I found this one that has a screen that is identical to the original screen that was in these, and it doesn't require trimming the inside of the plastic shell. And that was what I wanted because I wanted to keep this as stock as possible. If you turn it off, it doesn't even really look like it's modded, but it is, and it has a much more usable screen now. This one has some features, not as many as the original Game Boy. There's a sensor in here that can adjust the brightness and actually turn on a pixel grid, which was on at the moment, and turn it black and white with a pixel grid, and then just clear image. And for this one, I don't like using the pixel grid as much because the resolution of this screen isn't as high, so turning on the simulated pixel grid actually makes the screen way darker. So usually I just leave this one on the non-grid mode, but it still looks really good, and it's kind of what I would call a sleeper build if we were talking about a car or something like that. Without it being on, it appears basically stock. And then we have the original Game Boy Advance, which I honestly hold as the worst Game Boy screen. Even worse than the original Game Boy, because even though the refresh rate is better like the Game Boy Color, for whatever reason, the colors and just the brightness, if you can even call it that, even though there's no light at all, is just so much more dim. Even in direct light, this thing is hard to see. The colors are just so dark. It's why so many early Game Boy Advance games have really bright and garish color palettes, because they're trying to compensate for this screen being so dark. But we can fix that, just like with these other ones. This one also has a bit of a history to it. I originally put a screen from a Game Boy Advance SP inside of this, because there are ways to do that, and I was successful, but it was just an older way to mod these, because again, this was several years ago, and I just didn't like the results, mainly because it used up a lot of power. There was this weird voltage regulator thing I had to install. The inside work was just really messy with a bunch of wires. It worked, but I just wasn't happy with it. So once I started working on these other ones, I decided it was time to redo this one. So this is what they call an ITA kit, which is essentially the screen from inside a DSi. You have to trim the shell on the inside of this to get it to fit, which I used a Dremel for, so the actual inside of this shell is kind of screwed up. Well, I wouldn't say screwed up, but it looks interesting because there's a lot of plastic shaved away, but you can't tell from the outside, and the cable management on this kit is much easier to deal with, and the results are great. And you don't have to simulate the pixel grid because the pixel density from the DSi is the same as the Game Boy Advance, so it already has an authentic pixel grid. There's no doubling of resolution or anything. This isn't a screen from a smartphone. It's a DSi screen, and it works really well in here. There's also a touch sensor hidden up here somewhere. There it is, and it adjusts the brightness. I don't feel like my camera's really capturing this very well. The colors looked kind of weird in this video, if it turns out the same way that it looks on the viewfinder as I recorded, but in person, it doesn't look weird at all. It looks great. I actually think this is the best result out of all of them, because this is the best form factor for a Game Boy. It's just originally the worst screen. So yeah, these are my modded Game Boys. One day I'd like to do a Game Boy Pocket. Those are a bit trickier just because they run on two AAA batteries, so any backlit screen is going to absolutely wreck the battery life, and it causes some issues with games just because there's not as much power there. But at least having an original Game Boy and a Color and an Advance covers all the major iterations of the Game Boy until the SP, but from that point on, they have lights already. So now I've got a good way to play all my Game Boy games. One of several good ways to play on my Game Boy games, along with all of my other Game Boys and the Game Boy Player and the Super Game Boy. And you can never have too many ways to play Game Boy games. But this was a fun project, and I'm really happy with the results on all of these.